Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I am old, but I am trying something new. That is using an iPad to give my remarks, so bear with me. So, I don't really know how I ended up being a speaker here, but I do want to say that I am very grateful to be here. I've spent the last month engaged in a medical malpractice lawsuit against my former psychiatrist. And while I was technically in a courtroom, what I was subjected to felt more like what I might experience if I was in prison. And the judge was the warden and the opposing counsel was the prison guard. As naive as it sounds, I didn't anticipate the hostility that I encountered out in San Francisco simply because I dared to hold my psychiatrist accountable for the catastrophe he visited upon my life through his carelessness and indifference. So after that month in enemy territory, it feels good to be among friends and fellow So I want to thank the conference organizers for the invitation to be here today. I also want to congratulate everybody who worked on the conference. I know from experience how hard conferences are. I know what it feels like when everything doesn't go perfectly. And I also know what it feels like when your efforts are seemingly met by complaints from what appears to be ungrateful attendees. Now, I certainly don't want to be one of those ungrateful attendees. However, I've chosen as a topic of my keynote a subject that necessarily requires me to offer critique of our movement. In offering that critique, I will comment on what I think are problems with our movement, and I hope you will hear my comments in the spirit in which they are offered, with love, with commitment, and passion for the work of building and sustaining a successful Mad Pride movement. There's also really not enough time to do what I have set out to do, so this is just a very first draft, and I will be around to talk about this, and I will also follow this up with writing. With that in mind, just keep that in mind when you hear my remarks. So I managed to get through most of my life without any lived experience of the mental health system. So much of what my speech involves, really what informs my speech, is my experience in the civil rights movement, in the gay rights movement, and in the women's movement. But I'm not unfamiliar with the Mad Pride movement or the issues in the mental health system, because for 25 years, I was the guardian of my brother who has a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And I witnessed him suffer all of the side effects of antipsychotic medications, from tardive dyskinesia, diabetes, removal of his thyroid, weight gain, and end-stage kidney disease. And I saw none of the positive effects. That is to say, he still hears voices that supposedly justified his doctors forced drugging him. 5 years ago, I had my own personal experience with the mental health system after a psychiatrist misdiagnosed me with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and prescribed a stimulant that triggered a protracted, long psychotic manic episode that he failed to recognize and treat. I lost my job at UC Berkeley School of Law. I lost my home on Telegraph Hill in San Francisco, and I lost all of my money. So I was homeless and jobless and penniless for more than 2 years. But I vowed to become better, not bitter. I completely left the mental health system. I swore off medications, I swore off psychiatrists, I swore off therapists, and I swore off diagnoses. I was fortunate enough to get a job at an organization called Vermont Psychiatric Survivors. And you've heard a little bit about that organization. And I credit this job and the people and experiences I had in Vermont with helping me turn tragedy into triumph. Despite having lost every material possession in my livelihood as a lawyer and a businesswoman, I have never been happier and never felt a greater purpose in my life. The job also gave me a very broad perspective of the Mad Pride movement. Vermont Psychiatric Survivors provides peer support as well as individual advocacy and systems advocacy and legislative advocacy. VPS was behind the historic legislation in Vermont passed in 2007 that made an explicit legislative finding that there is no link between mental illness and violence. So the title of my speech is Crazy Lives Matter Too, Imagining a World Where Everyone is Valued. Now, I picked this topic before my medical malpractice trial began. At the time I picked this topic, I had three things in mind. The first was, what is the end goal of the Mad Pride movement? You know, what will the world look like when we have achieved our goal? I've been asking this question for years, and this speech opportunity gave me a chance to maybe ask the question and answer it. The second thing that was on my mind was this commercial that I always see that annoys me every time I see it. Now, the commercial or public service announcement is aimed at encouraging people to seek mental health treatment. And in the commercial, a visibly distraught woman talks to a man about her distress. And he encourages her to get help, that's air quotes, and reassures her that she's not, quote, crazy. For me, you know, I have the same reaction every time I see that commercial, and that is, well, what if she is a person that the world deems crazy? You know, for me, a successful Mad Pride movement must address this attitude that being crazy is the worst thing that can ever happen to you. You know, a successful Mad Pride movement must make the world safe for people who are deemed crazy. Or better still, a successful Mad Pride movement must eliminate this notion of crazy from the world's consciousness. And the third thing I had in mind was the intersection of psychiatric oppression and racism. Something that I think the Mad Pride movement has been slow to address and even ineffective in addressing. And I think the best example of this is what is happening with the conflation of mental illness and criminality. Now, there are many examples of these, and I'm going to give you a few. So earlier this year, I was in the Vermont State House listening to the commissioner of the Department of Mental Health talk. And a state representative interrupted her testimony and asked, "Isn't everyone in prison mentally ill?" Now, the representative who asked this question is considered a good guy, right? I was reminded, he's a good guy, Wilda. So he's a libertarian who voted against forced drugging when the matter was being considered in the Vermont legislature many years ago. So here's another example, also from Vermont. Earlier this year, our governor proposed to build a mega prison with a prison psychiatric hospital. And in response, a self-appointed group of good guys formed an ad hoc group to fight against the proposal. So these good guys suggested that the way Vermont should address its prison population is to get its help, that is, mental health treatment, implying that people in prison are mentally ill and that their mental illness is the reason for their incarceration. And my final example is from the New York Times. Several years ago, it ran an article about a prison in the Midwest that appointed as a warden a psychologist. The Times suggested that this was a good thing because most people in prison are mentally ill. I've even heard prisons referred to as our largest psychiatric hospitals. Now, I see this conflation of mental illness and criminality as the latest attempt by our state to maintain control over Black and brown bodies, a system which began with slavery and has today evolved into mass incarceration. Oppressive systems such as slavery and Jim Crow and mass incarceration are preserved through transformation. And now our society has grown tired of the cost of mass incarceration. I see mass incarceration being transformed into mass medicalization. And by mass medicalization, I mean turning prison inmates into mental patients. And of course, these prison inmates are disproportionately Black and brown. And mass medicalization is more insidious, meaning more dangerous and more subtle than mass incarceration. When someone is labeled with a mental illness, there is no due process. You don't get a trial. You don't get a jury of your peers. The burden of proof is not beyond reasonable doubt. It's a life sentence. Once you've been labeled with a mental illness, you will always have a mental illness, whether you recover or not. There is no time off for good behavior. Your sentence cannot be commuted. You can't be pardoned. It can also result in permanent deprivations of life and liberty from the harm of psychiatric drugs, drugs which will likely be forced on you, especially if you enter the system through the criminal justice system. And we are seeing this turn towards mass medicalization and the disproportionate impact on Black and brown people without any concerted effort on the part of the Mad Pride movement or psych survivors to address it or even name it or note it. And in some ways we have been complicit through our silence or even buying into the notion that people are in prison because of mental illness or because their crimes have landed them in prison because of mental illness. I also believe that our movement has missed this issue because our movement has not taken an intersectional approach to advocacy. That is, our movement has been white-centric and has failed to realize that none of us, whether you're white or not, none of us is any one thing. And that the ways in which we are oppressed as individuals are multidimensional. And our advocacy must reflect this intersectional oppression we experience because of our age, because of our gender, because of our class, because of our race, our religion, and our ability. And I don't think this is unique to our movement. I think the women's movements, the gay rights movements, and the civil rights movement have all historically failed to take account of sex, gender, race, and class differences within the movement. So these are all the things that are on my mind when I picked my title and topic. But two things happened since then. One is, I lost my medical malpractice case. It was a case I should not have lost, and my psychiatrist knew I shouldn't have lost it based on the sizable settlement he offered me before trial. And two, I received an email from a member of our movement questioning the title of my talk. The person who sent the email, who identifies as white, suggested that in labeling my talk Crazy Lives Matter Too, I was co-opting the message of the Black Lives Matter movement and decentering Black people. So these two things have caused me to sharpen the message I want to leave with you tonight. So the first part of my message is the Mad Pride movement is not working or focused on the root cause of our oppression. When I say oppression, I mean a system that says it's okay to force drug us. A system that says it's okay to have a separate and inherently unequal healthcare system to address so-called mental health issues. A system that discriminates against us in housing and employment and the freedom to associate. A system that hurls the word crazy as an insult. A system that makes us objects of treatment rather than participants. A system that uses mental health to threaten, control, and punish rule breakers, including the President of the United States, who, while admittedly is unlike any other president, it cannot reasonably argue that this man is impaired socially or occupationally. Now, what I see our movement focus primarily on is selling the idea of recovery and the importance of peer support and peer participation, things that I agree with. But when the organizers of this conference sent out a call for ideas about what our policy priorities should be for the Alternatives Conference, what came back were a list of about 8 goals, including things like ensuring peer participation, developing national and state policies that supported a recovery-based system, developing alternatives to involuntary treatment, not doing away with, but developing alternatives to involuntary treatment, funding basic human needs for mental health conditions, and protecting human rights of people labeled with mental health. Now, I'm not so much critical of these goals, but I believe that even if we were to achieve all of these goals, the oppression of people who have been labeled with psychiatric diagnosis would continue unchanged, because none of these priorities address the root cause or causes of our oppression. Now, what I believe is underneath our oppression, and I'm not saying that this is the only thing that is beneath or underneath our oppression or the root cause of our oppression, but I believe it is a significant part of our oppression, is the societal belief that people with psychiatric diagnoses or mental health challenges are not credible reporters or witnesses of our own experiences. When we speak, we are not believed, especially when what we say is at odds with with people our society finds more credible than we are, usually psychiatrists or our families. Psychiatrists have even institutionalized the practice of not believing us, borrowing the term anosognosia to tell the world that we lack insight into our illness and we are not to be believed when we say we are well. Now, I'm sure any of you who has ever seen a psychiatrist has your own personal story of not being believed simply because you were a psychiatric patient or had a psychiatric label. Now, in 2007, a woman called Miranda Fricker, a philosopher, called this phenomenon of not believing people based on prejudice epistemic injustice. Now, she defined epistemic injustice as when prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word. She gave the example of black people not being believed by police or juries when they're on trial. Juries don't believe black defendants, particularly in the face of contrary testimony from a police officer. Another example of epistemic injustice comes from women. Women are never believed when they say they've been raped or sexually harassed. And she explained that when people are not seen as credible witnesses to their own experiences, when people are not believed because of prejudice, the harm is so great that it actually prevents people from becoming who they are. She then went on to break down this notion of epistemic injustice into two types. The first type is testimonial injustice, and that's basically what I've been talking about. You try to tell people your experience and they don't believe you because of prejudice. The second type of epistemic injustice is what she calls hermeneutical injustice. Of course, she's a philosopher, so she's using these words that are not in our common parlance, but hermeneutical comes from the word hermeneutics, which is the system of a science of interpretation. So what she is saying is hermeneutical injustice exists where there is a gap in society, in our society's shared tools of social interpretation, so that someone is put at an unfair advantage when it comes to making sense of their social experiences. And the best way to understand this is an example. So she gives the example of sexual harassment. So, sexual harassment is a pretty recent understanding, right? It comes from the 70s. But obviously the behavior existed for many, many years before that. But women were unable to explain their experience of being bothered and at work based on their gender before this term existed. And so before you can identify, before you can actually explain your experience, and the society has shared tools of understanding your experience, it can't overcome it. So for years, women continued to be subjected to sexual harassment that went unchecked. Now, hermeneutical injustice is also, I think, an issue for psych survivors, because our society is ignorant when it comes to how the mental health system operates for people within that system. They only hear from psychiatrists, because psychiatrists are who they believe. And so when psych survivors try to explain the oppression in the system, it falls on deaf ears, because the listener does not have the tools or the background information necessary to make sense of our experiences in the system. So I think both forms of epistemic injustice, both testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice, have to be addressed by our movement if we are to ever make progress. If we are not believed when we relate our experiences, and if we in our society do not have the collective resources to interpret and make sense of our experiences, it does not matter how many committees we are on. It does not matter how many peer advocates are in the system. It does not matter whether our system is recovery-based or not. If we are not deemed credible witnesses to our own experience, and if we cannot explain or make sense of our own experiences of oppression, the oppression and discrimination are doomed to continue. Now, I learned this the hard way in my recent trial. The jury considered my psychiatrist a more credible witness to my own personal experience. Even though I told my doctor repeatedly that I thought I was manic, he did not believe me. And he managed to convince the jury to not believe me because they were primed not to believe me because I was a psych patient and he was a psychiatrist. And this was something that was difficult, if not impossible, for me to overcome because the jury did not have any collective tools at its disposal to understand why it should not believe the psychiatrist over me. Now, historically, most social movements have focused on rights. They have not directly addressed this issue of epistemic injustice. For example, the civil rights movement was focused on voting rights, the women's movement on equal pay, and the gay rights movement on the right to marry. That's my timer. I'm going to wrap up. I do think, though, that the Black Lives Matter movement is addressing this issue of epistemic injustice. It is not a movement focused primarily on rights. It is a demand to be deemed valued and valuable simply because we exist. Now, for years, Black people have told stories about their experiences with police officers, and they fell on deaf ears because they weren't believed. That's that testimonial injustice. And there was a gap in shared tools of interpretation of Black people's experiences with police. That's that hermeneutical injustice. But then came cell phones with video cameras. And white people got to see the multiple examples of how some police officers treated Black people. And this has gone a long way towards closing that gap in those shared tools of social interpretation and lessening the effects of hermeneutical injustice. Now, our movement doesn't have the benefit of video recorders in the same way that the Black Lives Movement has. However, most movements have theoreticians. These are people who write and create knowledge to help people make sense of their own experience and to educate society about those experiences. And that's what our movement needs. Our new movement needs more theoreticians. We need more people writing about oppression and how it operates in the unequal distribution of opportunity based on mental health status. In fact, I think we need fewer stories about recovery, which I think play into that master narrative that we are sick and we take our medicine and we can recover. We need more stories that say, despite our recovery, we are still oppressed and discriminated against because of the ideology of mental illness. And the second message I want to leave you with is our movement needs to put the most marginalized among us at the center of our activism so that no one gets left behind and we don't miss or ignore issues like the transformation of mass incarceration into mass medicalization that is disproportionately impacting brown and Black people who have been labeled, quote, mentally ill. When we put the most marginalized people among us at the center of our activism, we are actually at our most inclusive. No one gets left behind when we put the needs of the most marginalized among us at the center of our activism. And that is why I titled my talk, Crazy Lives Matter Too, Imagining a World Where Everyone is Valued. When I selected the title, I had in mind Black crazy lives. Rather than decentering people, Black people, I want our movement to put these so-called crazy Black lives at the center of our advocacy. The title of my speech is both a challenge to the Black Lives Matter movement and the challenge to the Mad Pride movement to become more intersectional in our advocacy. For me, what the Mad Pride movement looks like when it succeeds, it's a world where we are all valued, whether Black or white, well or unwell, crazy or not, whether we pay taxes or not, or hold a job or not. A world where people are valued and valued simply because we are people. That's right.